Good afternoon. My name is Steve Shepard. I'm the Senior Campaigns and Elections Editor and Chief Polling Analyst at Politico. I'm thrilled to be joined by my colleague, Laura Barron-Lopez, today for what should be a great discussion with two very smart pollsters, one Democrat, one Republican, about the 2020 election and the state of polling right now. We are only 97 days to go until Election Day.
We are kicking off this update with Democratic pollster Margie Omero of GBAO Strategies and Republican pollster John McHenry of North Star Opinion Research. We'll be answering audience questions throughout the segment. You can submit those questions by tweeting @Politico Live with the hashtag #AskPolitico.
One of the first questions that we got from readers who sent in their questions was, after 2016, how much confidence should the public have in the polling it's seeing right now? And I'm going to pose this to both of you, but Margie, if you could start.
Well, it's a question that pollsters get a lot. That's probably not a surprise. And I think we can see a few things. I mean, one, we have polls from 2018 that suggested that Democrats were going to be successful in a lot of congressional races and other races around the country, and that turned out to be true. There have been primary polls in states and around the country that turned out to do a good job of seeing how things were going. And also you've had a polling industry that has really adjusted in a lot of ways. Since 2016, there's been a lot of reports and studies. There are a couple new reports out today about this, a couple of current theories about polling veracity. So if you look at the Upshot, Nate Cohn, and Huffington Post, Ariel Edwards-Levy, both have some things about who participates in polls now, because the polls are so consistent that some folks are saying, is it that who responds in polling that is leading the polls to show such clear advantage for Democrats, or is this really the truth of where things are now? And a lot of research suggests that that it's not a difference of who participates. That in fact, the people who are more likely to participate in a lot of surveys are often Republican. And the theory that folks are nervous about saying that they support Trump and that suppresses Trump's vote in polling, that's not borne out by a lot of data. So I think there's been a lot of study about some of these theories over the last 4 years, and polling has gotten richer and more robust, a lot of more methodologies, a lot more people studying polling in journalism. And so I think people are really, looking to polling with, the right skepticism, but also acknowledging the amount of care that goes into it.
John, how do you see it?
Yeah, I mean, we get, as Margie said, we get asked this question a lot. It's as pollsters, that is the question that we get asked the most often. And the first response is typically, look, the national polling in 2016 was actually really good, where you see Hillary Clinton leading by 3 in the average of polls, and she wins by 2. So national polls are very good. State polls had some work to do, especially in the few polls that we saw in some of those Rust Belt states, in Michigan and Wisconsin. And those are the ones that lead you to believe that, President Trump was going to lose and he winds up winning because he wins very narrow margins there. For most of the political pollsters on both sides of the aisle, Democrat and Republican, their methodology probably hasn't changed a whole lot over the course of the last 4 years, because they were already using voter-based samples. They were already allowing, especially on the Republican side, we talked about this a lot, allowing a broader electorate in. If they said they were only somewhat likely, in 2014 and 2012, you might have screened those folks out. In 2016 and going forward, you let those people in just because you don't want to exclude some folks who very well might say, you know what, I'm going to go vote. If you're a respondent and you say you're only a 4 on a 1 to 10 scale on likelihood to turn out this year, but you hate President Trump, you're probably coming to the polls this year. Same thing on the other side. So we've expanded those screens a little bit to address that. You can always screen down and say, well, in a more likely voter model. But really, I think best practice in looking at registered voters is allowing the best possible methodology for people to look at and evaluate polls.
So there have been multiple polls showing voters across demographics favoring a Black woman running mate for Biden. Margie, could that drive voters towards Biden who are otherwise ambivalent, or is the VP choice unlikely to change a vote at this point?
Well, we won't know until we get there. And certainly, I think there are going to be a lot of voters who are going to be making their decisions in all kinds of different ways. And the VP pick certainly can be one of them. It's not often that the VP pick, upends a race in a real permanent way and changes the dynamic, changes the outcome in some way from what it would have been otherwise with a different VP pick. But there's such a great, strong bench of women candidates, potential VP candidates. I think you're going to have a lot of voters excited no matter who the VP pick is. And also, is a marker in time that we're kind of getting closer to the part where folks are going to be turning in a little bit more to the election and those who haven't yet made up their mind, thinking about how they're going to choose. But I think no matter who the VP nominee is, you're going to see a lot of folks really excited, a lot of women voters, a lot of people of color, Democrats who are leaning toward Biden, or voting for Biden, but excited to see who the VP pick is. So I think you're going to see voters excited no matter what.
I couldn't let you guys get away without talking about some Senate races. John, we've seen this recent slump for President Trump lead to Senate Republicans in some states like Cory Gardner in Colorado or Tom Tillis in North Carolina or Martha McSally in Arizona. They're trailing their Democratic candidate opponents at this point in the race. What's the best strategy for them? Is it to hug President Trump closely because they need his voters to come out? Or is it to try to draw some contrast? What can you see in the numbers that points to the best way forward for them to try to survive what looks like right now to be a pretty challenging reelection campaign?
Yeah, so I mean, the one thing that you can't do is just push President Trump arm's length away and say, I completely disavow him. You saw in 2016 what happened with with candidates who said, I just can't support this man after the Access Hollywood revelations came out. Those folks who did that typically lost. Obviously, it's a little bit more challenging because there are folks who are going to be in a tighter race in a swing state. Every vote counts, but no Republican can afford to lose a whole lot of votes that President Trump gets. The challenge is you have to get all of President Trump's votes plus 1%, 2%, 5%. Some of these folks are going to be able to do that because they have a history of, taking care of the state, being, more centrist than some of the other folks in the party, maybe drawing some not contrast, but some personal attention to what they've done, what their character is. You know me, I've been here all along type of thing, as opposed to specifically saying, I rebuke the president on X, Y, and Z.
Yeah. Margie, you mentioned this earlier, and I wanted to come back to it. The idea that there isn't this big hidden Trump vote that's not showing up in the polls. But what I was struck a couple of weeks ago by a Monmouth poll in Pennsylvania that showed Joe Biden with a huge lead, but a majority of voters said they believe there is a secret Trump vote, whether it's in their neighborhoods or state or in other parts of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Why is that? Where's the disconnect there? What does the research show about the idea of a hidden or Trump vote?
So I mean, that question, there's a lot there with that question. When I saw that question, I was like, oh, I wish I still had the podcast, the Pollsters podcast, so we could have spent like 45 minutes talking about that question. It's the kind of question that people who talk about polling and, write about and consume public polling, want to know the answer to, like, not just are there shy Trump voters, but do you know of any? It is very much kind of a sort of DC polling, what pollster fans want to know. That doesn't mean that voters know the answer, because they're responding in a different way. They're like, yeah, sure, I know. I bet I do know somebody. It doesn't mean that that actually is a person that they know who, if they were to talk on the phone to a pollster, would be embarrassed to say, I support the president, so would say something else. That's just, their assumption, their best guess, which is, is a best guess. And that's different from doing, a scientific exploration, which is what a lot of other polling outlets have tried to do, where they randomly assign people to either an online version of the survey, this is what Pew has done, or a telephone version of the survey. Because if you have that, shy Trump sense, then you would not tell the telephone interviewer, but you might be more honest online. And they found really no difference on all kinds of different metrics. And I've always kind of found the whole idea of the shy Trump things as sort of a laughable, like, secret weapon. Like, we have a secret weapon, and the secret weapon is that people are embarrassed to say that they support the president, that you know, they're embarrassed to say it out loud to a stranger over the telephone. That's the secret weapon that people, you know, on the right seem to kind of, you know, put the whole, you know, the whole electorate on, the whole election on. And to me, I find that a sign that you have a, you know, a campaign message and campaign in a lot of trouble. And certainly all the other polling, what happens beneath the surface, what you hear in qualitative, the, you know, who, you know, that there's no real difference just driven by party in terms of who, you know, participates in a survey. All those things taken together shows a lot more, you know, a lot more worrying signs for the president than this invisible shy Trump voter.
So Steve talked about the Senate. I want to go to one of the impacts down ballot in 2018, which was the suburbs, you know, pretty much abandoned Republicans and a lot of seats flipped to Democrats. That's why they won the majority. John, can Trump win without suburban voters, specifically white suburban women?
He doesn't need to do, almost by definition, any better in the suburbs than he did in 2016, but he does have to stay sort of within touching distance of President Biden there, or Vice President Biden. I mean, there's only so much that you can lose. The suburbs are obviously a huge demographic. It's almost like saying you have to do well among women. Well, yes, of course, they're a half to a majority of the electorate. So, and it'll be interesting to see what sort of issues sort of allow him sort of back into the game among suburban voters. Is it how he deals with civil unrest? When he calls out federal troops, when he calls out federal officers, do they, you know, add fuel to the fire, or do they calm things down? If Republican voters are seeing protests that, you know, are peaceful and everybody just seems to be advocating for the cause, I think for the most part, suburban voters go, okay, that totally makes sense. Once they see violence, they go, I don't know, maybe I actually would support Donald Trump to do a better job with that than Vice President Biden. So that's
Does that appear to be working? Does that appear to be working so far, though, as he's been tweeting about, you know, the suburbs being destroyed if Biden were to win the White House?
I think suburban voters are sort of keeping an eye on what happens over the summer. You know, one of the things that we've learned about 2020 so far is the world seems to change every, you know, 2 days. So a lot of that depends on, you know, does Portland just sort of calm down and everyone, you know, treats each other respectfully, or does that get inflamed? What happens in Chicago? That's, you know, if say Chicago just seems like it's on fire, literally, does that affect suburban voters? You know, I think that's one of the things running as a law and order candidate is something that Republicans sort of want to do naturally. It may be one of the best contrasts that the president can draw with Biden at this point. Some of that, I think, is just frustration and not being able to draw Joe Biden, you know, out of the proverbial basement. Where he gets to, you know, sort of, the vice president gets the opportunity right now to run as the generic Democrat. Re-election campaigns are always a referendum on the incumbent, but it's a two-step thing where first you say, do they deserve re-election or not? And then is the alternative better? If voters are saying, boy, I'd really like to look at someone else, and Joe Biden is the generic Democrat, he should win in that scenario. If they say, I think it's time for someone else, but boy, I don't know about Joe Biden on the public option, on, you know, on spending, on taxes, then there's a real decision to be made. And so far, they haven't really confronted that decision.
Okay. Just before we went live, just so our viewers know, the governor, Kate Brown of Oregon, said that she reached an agreement with VP Pence and federal officials for troops to be withdrawn. In terms of the unrest, last month we saw a seismic shift in public attitudes towards the Black Lives Matter movement. Margie Navigator, the Democratic polling project in your firm, that your firm is a partner with, found that 68% of Americans support the protest. Based on your polling, do you think that the support will translate into higher turnout among younger voters of color? Well,
so, you know, all this remains to be seen. But I think to go back to your other question about the suburbs and Trump's view on the suburbs is very much related to this, because when he's talking about the suburbs, he's talking about white voters. And we should remember that the suburbs are not, you know, all white, that the suburbs are very diverse. And so he has this kind of very sort of, I don't even want to say it's outdated. I don't know if it's was ever in date, but he has this, he has a completely false sense of what the suburbs are, and that he wants to, it's basically code for, aren't you scared of communities of color, in a way that doesn't just turn off communities of color, it turns off white voters. So his numbers on race have never been good, obviously, and they have gotten worse. And when he is seen as inciting violence and fueling the fire of what's been happening, his numbers get worse on this, and he's seen as the problem rather than as a solution to a problem. He's seen as creating a problem, and so we have seen that in Navigator that even with Republicans, younger Republicans, so this isn't just about what it means for turnabout communities of color, which for sure is something that a lot of Democrats in communities of color, white Democrats, have found Trump's behavior shocking. But we found even younger Republicans have moved away a little bit from Trump as a response to the protests. Older Republicans moved away from him a little bit as a response to his, which we haven't talked about, terrible response, a terrible ongoing lack of response to COVID. Has turned off older Republicans. Younger Republicans have found his views and actions and statements on race really shocking.
Over the past 4.5 months, as we've all been we're all doing this, I think, from our homes right now, confined at home, how has that affected the polls that your two firms are doing? One thing I've heard from a lot of pollsters is that, at least in the early days, a lot more folks were answering the phone. Is that what you've continued to find?
It's probably tailed off a little bit since those heady early days of mid-March, where people were practically calling you to participate in surveys just because they needed to talk to somebody. But really, and part of this goes to Margie's comment on turnout going up, sort of across the board. People are saying they're going to vote. They're, what else are they going to do? Of course, they're going to talk to you for 10 or 15 minutes on the phone. So those incidence rates and the participation rates continue to be pretty high over the course of this.
Yeah, and it's, we've also been able to do a lot of online focus groups. So it kind of, doesn't look exactly like this, but it looks sort of like a Zoom call. And that's also, I've been really pleased with how you are able to connect and build a rapport when you're talking to people on a video. I mean, it's not exactly the same as being in person, but it has been a good way to connect and reach voters, and they are engaged and they want to connect and start with talking about what they've been doing that's new in the current climate, and that's that people say some really joyful things in what is otherwise a very tough time.
So let's play a little bit of the 270 game. Arizona or Wisconsin, Margie, which is a better play for Biden and why? And then John, I'll ask you as well.
I mean, I guess I'm going to say both. I mean, Wisconsin certainly is, considered a tipping point state for, a variety of obvious reasons, but the public polls in Arizona have been quite good been quite good for Biden. Obviously, there's a targeted, a top tier battleground Senate race there that is important too.
So, John, where is Trump stronger in either of those two states, and why?
That is really a good toss-up question. If I was answering it from the Biden campaign, I say whichever one's cheaper, because I do think that they're both pretty evenly split. Tradition would say that Trump ought to be a little bit better in Arizona. With changing demographics, he might be just as strong in Wisconsin.
Okay, we're running a little short on time, so I think this is going to be our last question, and this is going to be another kind of multiple choice. 2-question option. Both of you have been studying the electorate for a long time and have worked in many different cycles now. We're in a situation where Joe Biden has a pretty significant lead, especially nationally, over President Trump. Which do you think is more likely, as we head into the final 97 days of this race, that Joe Biden's lead expands over President Trump, or that it contracts over President Trump?
I'm going to say it's probably more likely that it contracts. That might be a more fun way than saying this is as bad as it gets. But you would, and Obviously, the caveat on that is always what happens with coronavirus, what happens with the economy. You would think the economy would get a little bit better over the next couple of months. You would like to think that people would actually just put on a mask and coronavirus would get a little bit better. So I would think that he's probably at his nadir in the spread at this point.
I think it would be less surprising if it contracted. That would seem more in the range of what we're used to seeing. It would not be because of an actual positive action that President Trump would make.
Okay. Well, thank you, Margie and John, for your time. We really appreciate having you. This has been a great update on the 2020 election and the state of polling, which obviously I've been talking to both of you about for the better part of a decade now, and is something I'm always interested in continuing that conversation.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thanks.
Thank you. So before we wrap up, we want to provide some of our own insights and reporting on the state of the 2020 race. As our polling guru, Steve, where do things currently stand between Biden and Trump 97 days out?
Well, there are so many comparisons to 2016 that we keep hearing from people from both Republicans who are confident that President Trump's numbers could recover or that he could win even with significant elements of the electorate seemingly aligned against him, and Democrats who are obviously concerned that they may not win an election that they thought going in that they would win. So one of the things I've been looking at, and I created this chart to show you, is a comparison of where the race stood at this point in 2016 and where it stands now. And as you can see from both nationally, Joe Biden's lead, roughly 9 points. The two candidates were actually tied in late July going into the convention period in 2016, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And in each of the battleground states, Joe Biden has a larger lead than he had at this point, than Democrats had, than Clinton had in 2016. And in fact, Hillary Clinton trailed in Florida. Now, all 6 of these states, Donald Trump carried in 2016. And so these are states that Joe Biden needs to pick off, roughly 3 of them, depending on which 3 in the Electoral College math. But these are the kind of core 3 states. One other thing I wanted to flag here, though, is that note that Joe Biden's leads in each of these 3 states are still smaller than his national lead. And that's important because one thing we knew that Donald Trump in 2016 had an electoral college advantage, and he may have another advantage this year, which means Joe Biden can't just win the popular vote to become president. He needs to win by a significant enough margin to overcome that electoral college advantage that President Trump has. Now, as of now, he's currently ahead by that. But if this race were to tighten, I think, Laura, that's something that I'd be watching closely.
It's interesting.
Laura, yeah, I know you are reporter who tracks race and demographics in this race. Where do you see the kind of key subgroups when we look at the electorate and where Joe Biden and Donald Trump need to do well?
Right. So let's look at the numbers actually on this. We have a graphic that breaks down where Black voters, Hispanic voters, and other white voters are. So you can see that Black voters favor Biden, say that they would support him by about 78%. And then Hispanic voters, also a majority, say that they would support Biden. There's been this, talk from the Trump campaign that they say that they are going to try to win over some minority voters, Latinos, Black voters at the margins. But the likelihood that Trump could even win a majority of minority voters is not possible, given the polling that we see here and given past election cycles where the majority have gone to Democrats. So the issue there, and what Democratic pollsters like Margie and others have said, is that Democrats shouldn't be as focused on whether or not they will lose a lot of Black or Latino voters to Trump at the margins. It's those ambivalent voters. A lot of younger Black and brown voters are not as enthusiastic about a Joe Biden candidacy. It's what we saw during the primary, where more of them voted for candidates like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. And so that could potentially be an issue for Biden. We also see that Biden has eaten a bit into Trump's support among white voters. So Biden does well with college educated voters. And he also is starting to win over more of white working class voters, non-college educated. So
especially women, I think.
Exactly, right. Which is something that we also alluded to in the earlier segment, which is that women left Republicans in sizable numbers during the 2018 midterms. And so the big question is whether or not they will return to Republicans come this election or vote for Trump again. So Steve, I want to get to one final question before we go. It's an audience question. One of our viewers asked what Florida is doing to secure mail voting, and what do you say to voters who hear the president question the validity of mail ballots?
Florida, 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 right? The reality is actually Florida is remarkably well prepared for a massive influx of mail ballots because they already get that. I was looking at some of the 2016 results, and more than 2.7 million voters in Florida voted by mail in the 2016 presidential election out of 9.6 million votes cast overall. And then if you add on top, another 3.9 million voted early in person. So you had a situation where a majority of voters were actually taking part in the election before Election Day, in some cases well before Election Day. That makes them better prepared, I think, to handle the situations that unfortunately this pandemic has wrought when it comes to Election Day voting, where we have fewer polling places because they can't find the staff who are willing to work in a public setting for the whole day. A lot of election poll workers are older and more vulnerable to this kind of thing. You want to limit the number of people who are inside at one time, and that leads to these very long lines between the closure of polling places and the desire to encourage social distancing. You have these very long lines to vote on Election Day. Florida is probably better prepared, and Florida has a very secure mail balloting system right now. Now, that doesn't. I think that the challenge for Democrats is going to be convincing their voters to make use of mail voting. Republicans have done that actually better in Florida. Republican candidates usually win the mail-in vote in Florida because their voters are more used to it. Democrats have to do that. They have to make sure their voters follow the rules. I really do think that Florida is better prepared than some of these other states. We saw in Wisconsin in their spring primary, they weren't prepared at all.
Right.
They've spent the last 6 months or so kind of getting ready for what is going to be a really high stakes moment on Election Day.
And we also saw in Georgia that they weren't prepared as well. And some of that was because of new machines that were introduced into the system. And also it's important to remember that there have been studies that have shown from places like the Brennan Center and others that typically when issues like this arise with long lines at polling places and closed polling sites, that disproportionately impacts people of color. Yes.
And you mentioned Georgia. Georgia is not a swing state that we listed on our battleground list, but moments before we came on today, a new Monmouth University poll, 47-47, Biden and Trump, very, very close race in Georgia, 16 electoral votes. That's as many as Michigan. That's more than Wisconsin. So that could be another piece. We did the Arizona or Wisconsin trade-off. Right. That could be another piece to putting together 270 electoral votes for one of these candidates. Before we go, I know we only have a couple of minutes left. One question that we got a lot of from some of the folks on Ask Politico, and we're grateful for, is a question about third-party candidates. And oftentimes we see in these polls, they don't include the third-party candidates by name. There are Libertarian and Green Party candidates on the ballots in some states, not on in others. Ballot access is determined at the state level. You don't get kind of that automatic spot that you get from being a Democrat or a Republican, and that makes it tricky for pollsters. And I know we didn't get a chance to ask Margie and John about this, but one of the things that I've found in studying polling for a long time is that third-party candidates always do better in the polls running up to an election than they do when the votes are actually tabulated. It remains to be seen whether that's going to hold true this year. The one thing I can say is that looking at the polls, there are fewer voters who, when you do ask about third-party candidates or you offer voters an undecided option on a poll, fewer voters are taking that option right now than were taking it in 2016. Joe Biden is better liked right now than Hillary Clinton was in 2016, not by much, but by enough. And so I'm not certain, and I don't know what your reporting has borne out, Laura, but I'm not certain that we're going to see this huge influx of third-party votes this year. But I guess in a close election, every vote can matter.
It's true. I mean, again, it was at the margins that Trump won in 2020. So right now it doesn't look like a tight race, but as Margie and John mentioned, that they expect it to contract as we head closer to November.
Now, all this stuff is going to be super important and super interesting if this race does tighten. And that is the expectation from a lot of pollsters, as you mentioned. We've hit about the half-hour mark. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. It was great to spend time with you. Laura, great to see you. I know we've been
great to do this
for the last 4.5 months and not out on the trail as we would expect to be. But I want to remind you all that you can follow Politico Live on social media. We'll have more information on all of our upcoming virtual programming. We've got a lot of great stuff for you lined up around the upcoming conventions next month. So make sure you tune into that. Until next time, I'm Steve Shepard for Laura Barron Lopez. Thank you very much for joining.